Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be concluding Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. Right, so this video will cover chapters 10 through 13. I'm going to try to keep each section to 5 minutes or less, so I won't cover everything, but I'll cover the main thrust of the chapters. Right, so chapter 10 is titled The Distribution of Income. So it talks about why there's inequality of income, aka, payment. You can probably think off the top of your head why there's inequality in income, largely due to differences in taste, preferences, natural capacities, as well as tolerances for uncertainty and risk that sort of influence and sort of create the divide between people's incomes. But not only that, there's also differences in wealth through things like inherited wealth, which Friedman thinks are often ethically distinguished from the other causes of inequality, and in his opinion, unjustifiably. That is to say, people are more sanguine about inequalities in income from, natural talent or whatever, but they think it's immoral to inherit wealth, right? We don't bat an eye toward parents using their wealth to assist a child's education or training, giving them a leg up that way. And so, what's the fundamental difference or moral issue with a parent choosing to leave their wealth to their children? And kind of at the end of the day, all this kind of implies, as Friedman says, that on a technical and fundamental level, in a way, differences in wealth really come down just to chance, i.e. the genes that make us hardworking or lazy, a genius in business or finance, or our lineage. The problem, however, then is sort of ascertaining the justification, goal, and proposed mechanism to quote-unquote equalize incomes. This kind of prompts Friedman to move on to what is probably the densest section of the entire book. He talks about the mechanics of income or payment in the US and a little bit of the philosophy and economics behind that. Right, so how does payment work exactly? Well, in a market system, the idea is that there is payment in accordance with product, as it's known. And what does that mean? That means that you don't literally get paid with the literal ownership of the thing you produce or contribute to producing. Rather, you get paid commensurate upon the market value of your contributions, services, or product. Now, Friedman says that the system is primarily built around the efficient allocation of resources, supply and demand and all that. However, payment in accordance with product has also become an accepted value judgment in society, wherein it is ethical that people be paid in proportion to the value that they produce. All of this is to set up a critique of Marxism. So Marxists believe that the exchange value, in its purest sense, is determined by labor contributions, and that under capitalism, the laborers are exploited because they do not get the full compensation for the value of what they produce. Now, Friedman argues that, for one, Marx strangely and incorrectly discounts capital as embodied labor, so to speak, so as to keep up the appearance that product output and value is all just labor. But not only that, Marxism actually implicitly accepts the capitalist ethic in that it also accepts the value judgment of payment in accordance with product. Marxists believe that workers should get the full value of their labor, which is apparently to them literally everything. However, in doing so, they accept the capitalist principle that compensation should be tied to the final value contributed. I know that's kind of a lot to think about. Friedman next moves on to talk about how, yes, there's obviously going to be disparities in income across the country for all the reasons already stated. But just because there's income inequality in our capitalist country does no way imply that there's equal income in other systems. And history has proven as much as well. What's more, we have comparatively lots more social mobility than other systems. Next, Friedman sort of transitions to discussing and deriding the tax system the government uses to alter the distribution of income. Friedman does not like our arbitrary tax system and greatly prefers a uniform tax rate. He thinks it's silly how even two people with the same income can be taxed quite differently based upon the nature of their work. He thinks that such things subvert the market by discouraging entrance into ventures highly taxed, and it creates these games where everybody is trying to get all the tax loops they can get. For such reasons, Friedman opposes graduated or progressive taxes. He reasons that a uniform rate of 23.5%, when he was writing this in the 60s, would yield just as much as the current system actually did. He points out how, in his words, progressive taxation is less taxes on being wealthy, but rather is in effect taxes on becoming wealthy. Progressive taxes encourage the already wealthy to move their money around in arrangements least likely to get income taxed, while those becoming wealthy are hindered because they're obviously in the process of investing and getting returns in whatever ventures they're pursuing. In that way, the graduated tax structure is ironically manufacturing a more rigid class system. Anyway, so Friedman wants a flat tax on income above a certain exemption and the closure of all loopholes. That's his vision. He says it would be cheaper administratively and much easier to enforce, and he does do some math, and he thinks it would yield, in all of reality, just as much as the current wonky system does. Alright, I think we're ready to move on to the next chapter. Alright, chapter 11 is titled Social Welfare Measures. Here, Friedman discusses various social welfare programs and why they are counterproductive, actively harmful, and often unjustifiable, and as such, we shouldn't be taxed to pay for them. I'm just going to go over two of them, but he discusses more than the two I'm just going to mention for the sake of time, a minor one and the major one of the chapter. Right, so the minor one I'll talk about is public housing. To start off with, Friedman says it cannot really be justified on anything other than paternalistic grounds. The initial argument for public housing is always that low-quality housing imposes higher costs on the broader community, in the sense of fire and police department obligations and presence, for instance. But that does not justify public housing. If anything, it justifies extra taxes on the people who consume extra services. But people obviously don't want to tax more the low-income persons. So then the public housing is justified as about helping the poor. But there's no reason you need to subsidize housing to help the poor, as opposed to just simply giving them a cash subsidy or something. No, the proponents of public housing, although they deny it, think they know what's best for the poor, and will tell them what they need more than others. And they do not trust them enough to give them a cash equivalent. But put that aside. Friedman says that public housing has measurably worsened the housing of the poor in any case. He points out the number of dwelling units destroyed for public housing projects have not often been replaced, much less added to. All it has done is increase the amount of people per dwelling unit. Just increase the density, in other words. It's true, some families have been helped, and you can see them. It's obvious they're occupying the public housing. But what you don't see is the vast number of people who have been indirectly harmed because they've been displaced or put to the wind. And awareness of this, funny enough, often prompts cries for even more public housing. But what's more, the income limitations to qualify for public housing in the first place makes it so that its occupants are predominantly single-parent families, which, by every available statistic, greatly enhances the probability of children with behavioral issues, sadly. The problem being, then, is that they're all concentrated in one place, and then go to the same schools, overloading the system, as opposed to when they are more spread out in the community. Next is the main program that Friedman takes issues with. Like I said, he wrote this before, I think even LBJ's Great Society program came into effect, so take that for what it's worth. But next, Friedman discusses the Social Security system, which he thinks is an unequivocal invasion on the rights of the people, and completely unjustifiable. He breaks it down to its three unfortunate elements. Number one, the government is forcing every citizen to spend their money and purchase specific annuities. Number two, you were forced by the government to buy such annuities from the government. And number three, the value or benefit you are getting out of Social Security is not equal to the taxes you are forced to put into it. And from here, he sort of attacks each of those 3 points and breaks them down. He asks what is the basis for redistributing money from the young to the old, especially because if you're old, you get it regardless if you are poor or wealthy. Especially, as we see even today, the system is not self-financing, and it will only get worse because the population is starting to decline and skew older, which means a smaller and smaller tax base of young people will be supporting a disproportionate amount of older people who have a life expectancy much higher than when the system was created initially. But even assuming that it's a good thing for the government to force all of us to spend our money on old age annuities, why are we forced to buy them from the government? After all, we buy car or home insurance from private entities after all. And it has got more complicated since Friedman wrote this. Obviously, there's like pensions and IRAs and stuff like that, which is kind of like a private sort of insurance of a kind. But yet we still are forced to buy from the government as well. We're still forced to contribute to Social Security, even if we have private pensions or whatnot, or 401ks that are matched and stuff like that. In any case, Friedman argues that the government's nationalization of such annuities not only costs even more money from us for them to run, but it also disturbs our integrity to make our own choices, that is, with freedom itself. We once, here again, have bureaucrats and politicians who think they know what's best for us and do not trust us to make our own choices. You may very well say that Social Security stops the poor and old people from becoming wards of the state later on, but Friedman asks you to imagine a situation and a culture where that significant fraction of your income taken from your entire working life was not extracted from you to pay for Social Security over the course of your life, and you didn't have a culture of expecting a Social Security. Even under that such scenario, there probably would be a small percentage of older people who would be wards of the state, so to speak. But Friedman surmises that it'd probably still be cheaper and less restrictive to the entire country than every single person having to pay Social Security. Just having a small percentage of people needing government support at the end of their lives. And with that, we'll move on to the next chapter. Right, chapter 12 is titled The Alleviation of Poverty. And the next two chapters are pretty short, so I guess I don't have a lot of commentary. But this chapter is perhaps the most surprising of them. So instead of all the poorly thought out programs mentioned and not mentioned, Friedman proposes a negative income tax. That is, that those below a certain base income level would receive cash payment. Cash payment would eliminate the need for many of the seemingly infinite social programs and their associated administrative costs in favor of directly addressing the poorest in society in the way most useful to most, while simultaneously avoiding the targeting of certain occupational or age groups, as such is the case now. And Friedman does the math here that I do not see a reason to necessarily relay, and mentions that it would probably take some discipline from the electorate to not overdo things or overreact. Right. Some people think it's kind of like a almost proto-version of a universal basic income, kind of, but it's missing the universal element. Yeah, the math, for his time at least, checks out. And it would be certainly more in line with the whole freedom element of capitalism and freedom. Like I said, this chapter is pretty short, so that's really all there is to say. He's advocating for a negative income tax. That's about it. All right, I guess we'll move on to the final chapter. Chapter 13 is appropriately titled Conclusion. And like the previous one, this chapter is really short, and it kind of summarizes the entire work. For that reason, I think it's best for me to simply just read out a few select paragraphs from the conclusion and let him speak in his own words. There's not much I could add to this. It just kind of speaks for itself. So I'll begin. In the 1920s and the 1930s, intellectuals in the United States were overwhelmingly persuaded that capitalism was a defective system inhibiting economic well-being and thereby freedom, and that the hope for the future lay in a greater measure of deliberate control by political authorities over economic affairs. The conversion of the intellectuals was achieved by a comparison between the existing state of affairs, with all its injustices and defects, and a hypothetical state of affairs, as it might be. The actual was compared with the ideal. The attitudes of that time are still with us. There is still a tendency to regard any existing government intervention as desirable, to attribute all evils to the market, and to evaluate new proposals for government control in their ideal form, as they might work if run by able, disinterested men, free from pressure of special interest groups. The proponents of limited government and free enterprise are still on the defensive. Yet conditions have changed. We now have several decades of experience with governmental intervention. It is no longer necessary to compare the market as it actually operates and government intervention as it ideally might operate. It is clear that the difference between the actual operation of the market and its ideal operation is as nothing compared to the difference between the actual effects of government intervention and their intended effects. Which, if any, of the great reforms of past decades has achieved its objectives? Have the good intentions of the proponents of these reforms been realized? Regulation of the railroads to protect the consumer quickly became an instrument whereby the railroads could protect themselves from the competition of newly emerging rivals, at the expense, of course, of the consumer. An income tax initially enacted at low rates and later seized upon as a means to redistribute income in favor of the lower classes has become a facade, covering loopholes and special provisions that render rates that are highly graduated on paper largely ineffective. Monetary reforms, intended to promote stability in economic activity and prices, exacerbated inflation during and after World War I and fostered a higher degree of instability thereafter than had ever been experienced before. Social Security measures were enacted to make receipt of assistance a matter of right, to eliminate the need for direct relief and assistance. Millions now receive Social Security benefits, yet the relief rolls grow and the sums spent on direct assistance mounts. There have been some exceptions. The expressways crisscrossing the country, magnificent dams spanning great rivers, orbiting satellites, are all tributes to the capacity of government to command great resources. The school system, with all its defects and problems, with all the possibility of improvement through bringing into more effective play the forces of the market, has widened the opportunities available to American youth and contributed to the extension of freedom. However, if a balance be struck, there can be little doubt that the record is dismal. The greater part of the new ventures undertaken by government in the past few decades have failed to achieve their objectives. The United States has continued to progress. Its citizens have become better fed, better clothed, better housed, and better transported. Class and social distinctions have narrowed. Minority groups have become less disadvantaged. Popular culture has advanced by leaps and bounds. All this has been the product of the initiative and drive of individuals cooperating through the free market. Government measures have hampered, not helped this development. Is it an accident that so many of the government reforms of recent decades have gone awry? That the bright hopes have turned to ashes? Is it simply because the programs are faulty in detail? I believe the answer is clearly in the negative. The central defect of these measures is that they seek through government to force people to act against their own immediate interests in order to promote a supposedly general interest. They seek to resolve what is supposedly a conflict of interest or a difference in view about interests, not by establishing a framework that will eliminate the conflict or by persuading people to have different interests, but by forcing people to act against their own interest. They substitute the values of outsiders for the values of participants, either some telling others what is good for them, or the government taking from some to benefit others. These measures are therefore countered by one of the strongest and most creative forces known to man, the attempt by millions of individuals to promote their own interests, to live their lives by their own values. This is the major reason why the measures have so often had the opposite of the effects intended. The preservation and expansion of freedom are today threatened from two directions. The one threat is obvious and clear. It is the external threat coming from the evil men in the Kremlin who promise to bury us. The other threat is far more subtle. It is the internal threat coming from men of good intentions and goodwill who wish to reform us. Impatient with the slowness of persuasion and example to achieve the great social changes they envision, they are anxious to use the power of the state to achieve their ends and confident of their ability to do so. Yet, if they gain the power, they would fail to achieve their immediate aims and, in addition, would produce a collective state from which they would recoil in horror and of which they would be among the first victims. Concentrated power is not rendered harmless by the good intentions of those who create it. And with that, we have reached the end of Capitalism and Freedom. I'm sorry it took so long to make these videos come out. It took way too long. I'll definitely have a more planned out process next time. But if you made it to the end of this video, I'd like to thank you for watching. Yeah. What do you think about the book? Do you agree? How well does it hold up? Has Friedman been vindicated? Or have things changed too much for what he says to hold much serious weight? I'll let you consider his words. With that, I'll leave you, and, well, I hope you have a good one.